Let's take a trip back in time, way back, 300 million years to be exact. Imagine an alien planet, but it's not in some distant galaxy, it's right here on Earth. A world covered in bizarre, towering forests and stocked by insects the size of birds. This unbelievable lost world left something behind, a black rock that, believe it or not, powers our lives today.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it. Our entire modern world, it was built on this black rock, a strange inheritance from a time we've all but forgotten. So, to really get the story behind coal, we have to become time travelers. We have to go back and visit the spectacular and, frankly, very strange world that created it.
So, what do we call this era? This is the Carboniferous period. The name literally comes from Latin. Carbo means coal, and ferro means to bear or to carry. So it's the coal-bearing age. And this wasn't just some brief moment. We're talking about a 60 million year-long chapter in Earth's story that completely revolutionized the planet.
Okay, so if we want to understand where coal comes from, we have to start with our first clue, the raw material itself. But I need you to forget everything you think you know about forests, because this was something else entirely. Something far, far stranger. Yeah, you're not going to find any oak or pine trees here. No way. The kings of this forest were plants like Lepidodendron, the scale tree. Now, these weren't actually trees in the way we think of them. They were gigantic relatives of today's tiny little club mosses. You know, that little plant you might step over on a hike? Well, back then, they were scaled up to an incredible size, creating these vast, misty swamps that just stretched on forever.
I mean, some of these giants grew up to 40 meters tall. That's like a 13-story building. And their trunks weren't even solid wood. They were hollow, supported by this thick, tough bark with a pattern that looked just like reptile scales. They had this live fast, die young kind of life cycle. They grew incredibly fast, and when they died, they toppled over into the swamps, creating just a staggering amount of raw organic material.
But here's the thing, these forests weren't just growing, they were acting like a giant air conditioner for the entire planet. Through photosynthesis, they were breathing in huge amounts of carbon dioxide and pumping out tons and tons of oxygen. They were literally re-engineering the air itself. And that brings us to our next absolutely wild clue.
All of that extra oxygen getting pumped into the atmosphere, it had a truly mind-blowing side effect. It created a supercharged, high-oxygen world that allowed life, especially insects and other arthropods, to just shatter all the modern rules of size.
Up in the sky, you have to remember, there were no birds yet, no pterosaurs. So who ruled the air? Well, meet Meganora. Think of a dragonfly, but with a wingspan of 70 centimeters. That's the size of a modern hawk. They were the absolute kings of the Carboniferous sky, and there was nothing up there that could touch them. And if you were brave enough to look down on the forest floor, you might see this crawling past, Arthropleura. This was a relative of today's Millipedes that grew up to 2.5 meters long. That's longer than a king-sized bed. Covered in armor plating, it was basically an invincible tank, the biggest land invertebrate in the entire history of Earth, period.
So you have to be asking yourself, how is this even possible? A bug that big today it wouldn't work. Its body couldn't support it. So what was the secret ingredient? What was the cheat code that allowed the Carboniferous to become this land of giants? Well, the answer was literally in the air they breathed. See, our atmosphere today is about 21% oxygen. Back then, it peaked at nearly 35%. Think of it like this. Today's air is regular fuel. Carboniferous air was high-octane rocket fuel. It supercharged the simple breathing systems of insects, letting them get enough oxygen to power bodies far, far larger than what's possible today. Okay, so we've got the fuel, these massive forests, and we've got the bizarre, high-oxygen world they created. But there's a key part of the puzzle missing. For all that wood to become coal, it couldn't just rot away like a log does today. And the final clue lies with the planet itself, which set the perfect trap. The Earth itself was going through some major changes. Continents were literally smashing into each other, forming the famous supercontinent Pangaea. This massive collision created these huge, sinking basins right near the equator, which then flooded over and over again as sea levels rose and fell with the distant ice ages. It created the absolute perfect conditions for preserving a forest. What you had was the perfect recipe. When those giant trees died, they fell into stagnant, swampy water that had very little oxygen. The water was acidic, which meant the normal bacteria and fungi that cause rot just couldn't survive.
So as the land slowly sank, new forests grew on top of the old ones, burying them layer after layer. It effectively pickled the wood for millions of years. And this process just repeated over and over for millennia. These layers of pickled wood built up into thick deposits of what we call peat. As they got buried deeper and deeper, the incredible heat and pressure from the earth squeezed out all the water and cooked that peat into the dense, carbon-rich rock that we know as coal.
And when you really stop and think about it, that's just amazing. Every single lump of coal is a time capsule. It's a battery that was charged with sunlight. Not yesterday's sunlight, but sunlight that fell on an alien world, captured by those bizarre scale trees, and then stored underground for 300 million years.
But you know how it goes. All good things must come to an end. This unique world, this paradise for giant plants and giant insects, it couldn't last forever, and its end was just as dramatic as its existence.
About 305 million years ago, the climate suddenly changed. It got a whole lot cooler and drier across the globe. This triggered what scientists call the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. Those vast, continent-spanning swamps dried up and broke apart into little islands of forest. For the animals that depended on that wet world, it was an absolute catastrophe.
But you know, every crisis creates an opportunity. The giant amphibians, who needed water for their eggs, were in big trouble. But another group was ready and waiting in the wings, the reptiles. Their tough, scaly skin was a good start, but their secret weapon was the amniotic egg. It was basically a self-contained pond, a private little ocean for their developing young, which meant they could finally break free from the water and conquer the new, drier world. So when we look back, the legacy of the Carboniferous is just immense. It gave us the coal that literally fueled the Industrial Revolution. It supercharged our atmosphere with oxygen. It created the rich soils we depend on. And yeah, it cleared the way for the age of reptiles and eventually the dinosaurs. It really did shape the world we live in today.
And this is where the story really connects to our world today. The whole story of the Carboniferous was about taking carbon out of the atmosphere and burying it underground. It was a massive act of carbon fixation that ultimately cooled the entire planet. And what are we doing in the modern era? The exact opposite. We're running that 300-million-year-old process in reverse at hyperspeed.
Which leaves us with one last, pretty big thought to chew on. The very same geological process that gave us these black diamonds to build our civilization was also the process that acted like a global thermostat, cooling the planet down. By digging up that ancient world and burning it, we're now cranking that thermostat back up.
And that is our quick look into the Carboniferous. I mean, what an absolutely epic time in Earth's history, right? The story of this forgotten world, its giant forests and monstrous creatures, is so huge that what we've been able to share with you here, honestly, it's just a prologue. For a much deeper dive into this lost world and its incredible legacy, be sure to check out the complete version of this explainer.
All right, time travelers, let's do this. Today, we're jumping back, way back, 300 million years into the past to a period called the Carboniferous. And trust me, this place was alien. We're talking about a world of giant, steamy forests, skies ruled by monstrous insects, and huge evolutionary leaps that would change the planet forever. But how well do you really know this lost world? Well, we're about to find out. So, here's the mission. I've got a 10-question pop quiz to guide us through this ancient landscape. I'll throw a challenge your way, you take a second to think, and then I'll reveal the answer. Make sure you keep score. Let's see if you can nail a perfect 10 out of 10. You ready? Let's dive in. Okay, first things first, let's get our bearings. Our very first challenge is all about the name of this period. Now, think about it. Most geologic periods, like the Jurassic, right, they're named after places. In that case, the Jura Mountains in Europe. But the Carboniferous is different. It's named for a substance. Do you know which one? And more importantly, why? And the answer is coal. The name literally means coal-bearing. It's a mashup of the Latin words carbo, for coal, and ferro, which means to bear or to carry. So right from the get-go, this era is defined by what it produced. And the history behind the name is actually fascinating. British geologists came up with it in 1822, smack dab in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. For them, the most important thing about these ancient rocks wasn't some mountain range, it was the black diamonds, the coal, that was fueling their entire world. The name itself is really a reflection of our own history. Okay, 1 down, 9 to go. How are you doing so far? All right, so we know why it's the coal-bearing period. Now, let's meet some of the locals. And let me tell you, they were absolute giants. So I want you to just picture a sky with no birds, no bats, no pterosaurs. The job of top aerial predator was wide open. So what creature stepped up and claimed that throne? The king of the Carboniferous skies was Meganeura. Now, this wasn't just some dragonfly. This was a monster. We're talking about something the size of a modern crow. To this day, it's the largest flying insect that has ever existed. Just look at that number. Its wingspan could hit 70 centimeters. That's almost 28 inches. Can you imagine that thing buzzing past your head? With its massive eyes and spiky legs, it would just snatch other bugs, and even small amphibians, right out of the air. Okay, so Meganeura had the skies on lockdown. But down on the forest floor, something even bigger was crawling around. So what was the largest land invertebrate in history? Meet Arthropleura. This thing was a relative of today's millipedes, but it could grow longer than a person is tall, over 2.5 meters. It was literally an armored tank roaming the undergrowth, weighing in at an estimated 50 kilograms. This fact is just incredible. The fossilized tracks it left behind were so wide that when paleontologists first found them, they thought they were tire tracks from some kind of giant vehicle. But here's the twist. Despite its absolutely terrifying appearance, all the evidence suggests Arthropleura was a gentle giant, a peaceful herbivore, just munching on rotting plants. So this begs a pretty big question, right? A crow-sized dragonfly, a car-sized millipede. This isn't normal. There had to be some secret ingredient in the environment that let them get so huge. What was it? And the answer is oxygen. So much oxygen. Just look at this chart. The atmosphere back then might have peaked at nearly 35% oxygen. Compare that to our 21% today. Since bugs like these breathe through little tubes in their bodies, this super oxygenated air basically supercharged them, letting them blow past their normal size limits and grow to monstrous proportions. But there's always a catch, right? This high oxygen world had a terrifying side effect. The air was incredibly flammable. You could light damp wood on fire with no problem. And we have fossil evidence, tons of charcoal, that suggests the world was constantly being swept by massive, ferocious hyperfires. It was a literal planet of fire. Now, while all these giants were roaming around, there were some quieter, but honestly even more profound changes happening. And these changes would set the stage for the world we live in today. So at this point in history, amphibians were the big vertebrates on land, but they had a huge weakness. They were still tied to the water. They had to go back to lay their eggs. What was the evolutionary invention that finally let them cut that cord? The answer was the amniote egg. And you can see the difference right here. Amphibian eggs are basically little blobs of jelly that have to stay wet. But the amniote egg, it was a total game changer. It had a protective shell and all these internal membranes. It was like a personal portable pond for the embryo. This was the key that allowed the very first reptiles to finally leave the swamps behind and conquer the dry heart of the continents. So these early reptiles are starting to explore a world that looked truly alien. The forests weren't filled with pine trees or oak trees. So what were these strange trees that made up those enormous coal swamps? The forests were dominated by these things called giant lycophytes, which are relatives of today's teeny tiny club mosses. The big ones were lepidodendron, the scale tree, which had this really cool diamond pattern on its bark, and sigillaria, the seal tree, which looked like a giant pillar with a weird tuft at the top. But they weren't really trees. They grew super fast, they'd reproduce just once by releasing a massive cloud of spores, and then they'd just die. Okay, so you have trillions of tons of these weird, fast-growing trees falling down all the time. But here's the big question. Why didn't they just rot, like a log does in the forest today? How did they become the coal that gave the period its name? Well, it was basically a perfect storm of conditions. When these plants died, they fell into these acidic, oxygen-poor swamps. This water basically pickled them, stopping the bacteria and fungi that caused decay from doing their job. Then, you had sinking geological basins that allowed massive, thick layers of this plant gunk, called peat, to build up. And finally, millions of years of pressure squeezed and cooked that peat into the coal seams we dig up today. All right, let's take a quick break from the swamps and dive into the oceans. The Carboniferous is actually known as the golden age of sharks, and evolution was just running wild experiments. So what was one of the absolute weirdest predators swimming around out there? I want you to meet Edistus, the scissor-toothed shark. Now, unlike modern sharks, this thing didn't shed its teeth. As new teeth grew in, they pushed the old ones forward, creating these horrifying, curved rows of teeth that stuck out of its mouth like a giant pair of shears. Just an absolutely bizarre and terrifying evolutionary experiment. But this strange, vibrant, high-oxygen world, it couldn't last forever. So in our final section, we're going to see how it all came crashing down and what its lasting impact is on our world right now. For millions and millions of years, these swampy rainforests covered the globe. But then, around 305 million years ago, they were absolutely devastated by a massive climate event. What was it called? The event is known as the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, and this timeline just shows how dramatic it was. The planet got a lot cooler and a lot drier really fast. That huge, continuous rainforest that wrapped around the equator shattered into these little isolated islands of green surrounded by arid landscapes. This was terrible news for the amphibians and giant bugs, but it was a golden opportunity for those new reptiles, whose tough skin and special eggs were perfectly suited for this new, drier world. And here we are, our final question. Question number 10. We've seen giant bugs, alien trees, and incredible evolutionary leaps. But what is the single most significant, most direct legacy of this period on us, on human civilization today? And the answer, of course, brings us right back to the beginning. It's the coal. All of that solar energy that those bizarre forests captured 300 million years ago was locked away underground. And we're the ones who figured out how to unlock that ancient sunlight to power the Industrial Revolution and build the entire modern world. And this right here reveals a pretty profound paradox. See, back in the Carboniferous, all those plants were pulling massive amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, burying it as coal, and actually causing the planet to cool down. Today, we're doing the exact reverse. We're burning that same coal, releasing all that carbon back into the atmosphere and causing global warming. We are actively unwinding a 300-million-year-old climate event. And that's our 10 challenges. So, how did you do? Did you ace it, get a perfect score, or did you learn a few new things about this incredible lost world? I mean, this was the era when life truly took over the land, building the foundational ecosystems that we still depend on today. The ghosts of the Carboniferous really did fuel our civilization. And now they're forcing us to deal with this 300-million-year-old inheritance. Their legacy became the coal right beneath our feet. And that really just leaves us with one final thought. What will our legacy be?